how did it start?
Yeah, how did it start?
Okay. Well, WLTL really got started, it's my understanding, which I really actually only learned about recently, is that it came out of the LT Amateur Radio Club from like maybe the 65, 66 school year. And two members of that club were Terry Marsala, who ended up being our first station manager, and Wayne Terrell, who ended up being our first chief engineer. They were kicking around the idea, and they had heard about non-commercial licenses. And actually, with the help from the faculty sponsor of that club, which was Orville Warning, physics teacher, they put together a proposal to the Dr. Reber and the school board. And oddly enough, I think it was accepted, and they allocated funds and hired a consulting engineer to prepare the applications for construction permits and for final licensing. And then they were actually putting the station together in my junior year, which would have been 67, 68. We went on the air January of 1968, I believe.
So do you remember anything from literally building WLTL?
I didn't participate in any building other than, it was, the main equipment was there when I got involved. I was involved somewhat in, the hookups and getting things organized and getting ready to go on the air. I got involved in WLTL through a friend, Craig Conley, also class of 69. And he was into radio since grade school. He was an avid radio fan, and he ran a pirate station out of his bedroom, and I used to participate with that a little bit. But he was the real radio guy, and in the summer of 67, he heard about that LT was planning a radio station, and he knew about the FCC licensing. So he told me, well, why don't we go get our licenses in advance of this, new station? So we went downtown and bought a study guide for the exam, and a little later went down and sat for the exam and passed, and our licenses were issued just before the start of that school year. So then later that school year, the true founders, Terry Marsala, Wayne Terrell, and Bruce McCormick, and a few others, held an organizational meeting in the auditorium for anyone who was interested in the radio station. And we went, and a lot of the discussion at this meeting was the fact that people had to get licensed, and they were announcing plans to organize licensing study groups and all this stuff. So at the end of that meeting, Craig and I went up front, and we pulled out our licenses, and they were like, wow, how'd you even know about this? It's like, wow, on your own initiative you did. So we were kind of in from that point. And later that year I was made the assistant chief engineer to Wayne Terrell. Now oddly enough, Craig, who was the real radio guy, later that fall, he got a new job and a new girlfriend, and we didn't see much of him. I pretty much lived at the station that whole spring and then the following year.
It's pretty cool. It might interest you to know that we now do the FCC test online. We started that this year. We're do the FCC test by February 20th or something like that.
Is there I thought licensing was gone.
I think. I don't think it's a FCC thing. I think it's for our purposes.
Okay.
So because we require people, on-air personalities to know what's.
Okay.
So that's.
Yeah, my understanding is that the FCC licensing was phased out by deregulation in the 80s, I think, and it's no longer. So basically, you had to have at least a third-class radio telephone license with broadcast endorsement to be signed onto the transmitter on the engineering logs.
Oh yeah, that's gotcha.
So we needed a lot of engineers.
Yeah. I also I wanted to ask then, like, once radio got started, what was it like? Like, what was I suppose, like, what was the student atmosphere, I suppose, during those first years at WLTL?
Well, you do have to remember it was, you know, there were no classes. I understand classes didn't come till later in the 70s, but so it was strictly a club, a student activity. And we didn't have tryouts. I think the founders kind of weeded out a little bit all the people who wanted to participate, but it just sort of ended up, if you were interested in it and wanted to work, you could just show up and work. And I mean, it was a small core, maybe about a dozen people that were really active and kept the thing on the air. We had a long schedule that spring semester. And remember, staffing was an issue. Like, we were supposed to be on the air till 7 o'clock on weeknights, but a lot of times we'd have no DJ, no engineer, and we'd sign off early. So it was a very cooperative, you know, let's get this thing on the air and make some radio.
I remember you saying that there wasn't a lot of, like, adult supervision, like it was almost all students.
It was all students. There was essentially no adult supervision. Our first year faculty sponsor wasn't faculty, he was the audiovisual coordinator. So he knew about, like, audio equipment and stuff, but I don't really know if he knew anything about broadcasting either. But he spent most of his time at South Campus, and we, like, never saw him up there.
And you guys were in the Vaughn building, right?
We were in the Vaughn building on the 3rd floor. We had 3 rooms, control room, DJ studio, and the large studio. That's the one with the archtop windows you can see if you look up from the front entrance. And we didn't really originate any programming out of the big studio. It was like our lounge and storage room, meeting space, you know.
That's essentially what we still have here. Just basically a couple of recording studios, the main one, and then a lounge. It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to ask what programming did you guys do? Like, what would listeners actually hear on the air?
Well, my recollection is we predominantly, I mean, we wanted to be a rock station, right? We predominantly did DJ format music. But that was a lot of hours to fill. And I believe we filled, especially because we went on the air at 2:30 before school was even out, we filled with these educational programs that were transcribed. You could subscribe to these. They came from obscure colleges around the country and usually came on vinyl. And they were maybe half-hour or hour-long shows of, you know, American history or science shows. And, you know, they were like royalty-free and everything. So we would just, you know, slap those on the air to fill hours when we didn't have a DJ available.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And let's see, what else did I want to ask?
We may have produced a small amount of our own programming with interviewing people, talking about other clubs and activities, school activities, things like that. But that wasn't the thrust was, you know, we were like rock.
So
and that's what we wanted to do.
So what would be like a typical show that a student would do?
Well, I mean, we did have some variety. We did have somebody that did a jazz show. We had somebody who did a blues show. But we were predominantly, you know, what today is classic rock was our music back then. And it was mostly that. Some teams, I know a guy I'm still good friends with, Jim Curto, this was probably in our senior year, did a team show with Paul Garby. They were both class of 69. And from the Sunshine Room, which is what they called the DJ studio, and we would take call-ins for requests. We would never put phone calls on the air, however, because we didn't have a 7-second delay. So we would just in the control room, take requests, and tell the DJs.
Well, do you have any like specific memories, like stories from WLTL, like from the early days? Like anything that just like comes to mind immediately?
Yeah, well, I do. I really remember the first time we tried a sports remote, because there were sports-minded people involved from the beginning, and they really wanted to do live, play-by-play of LT Sports, but we didn't have any equipment, not in the first year. We had nothing to do a remote with. So we kind of brainstormed it, and we thought, we're in the Vaughn building. The gym is down below us 3 floors and a little to the north. And in fact, the broadcast area, because WTAQ in LaGrange broadcast LT home games as well. And their table was on the far south end of the gym. So we're looking at it, it's like, we got a lot of microphone cable. We could daisy chain a bunch of mic cables and probably make it all the way down 3 floors and into the gym. And one Friday night or whatever, when there's a home basketball game, that's what we did. And several hundred feet of cable. We had almost no signal back in the control room, no preamp on it or anything other than what was in our console. So we just had to crank everything to max, and it was, the level was okay. You could hear them. Now, they shared one mic, the play-by-play in color, and actually we have a picture from the tab that year. There were actually 4 people at the WLTL table. So I don't know if they were all on air or what, but they all were sharing one mic, and we, of course, had no communication with them. So our instruction was, you got to assume you're on the air all the time, don't stop talking. And we just waited for suitable breaks where we could cut in the control room and do our mandatory station IDs and such.
I suppose you guys didn't try to do that with Bent Field.
No, that would not have. But in my senior year, my friend Craig Conley, again, he swears for one game he did color for a football game from Bennett Field. So I don't specifically remember it, but we must have picked up some remote gear and rented a phone line by that time.
I just also wanted to ask, you obviously see what the station is now. Just from like a personal point, what's it like being part of something that like was in the very beginning and has grown to be something, I would say, probably a lot different than from what it was.
Well, it's amazing. It's the LTL is still around after 50 years. It's like I heard from some of those later alums that there was times in its history where the school was sort of thinking about shutting it down. So I'm certainly glad it's still here. I'm glad to see it still promoted on the website as student run, and that the executive positions are all students. I understand that's how we started, but I understand particularly back in the day, that was very unusual for high school radio. They were usually tightly controlled by faculty, tightly tied to coursework. Like you couldn't get on the air unless you were taking a class, that sort of thing. But it's great that it's still here and that it's student run. You now have television as well.
Yeah. And I suppose, I hope I'll have enough battery life. So how did like WLTL, how did it affect you for like later on, like in your life?
Well, I think it had a great positive impact on my life, but it didn't lead me into a career in broadcasting or electronics. And I never really thought it would. I treated it more like a fun thing to do and a real hobby, but not really a vocation. I did, however, end up staying with technical things. I'm an industrial hygienist now, do occupational safety and health, and still deal with a lot of exotic equipment and keeping equipment running and training other people how to use equipment. And, you know, back from LTL, teaching, you know, sophomore engineers how to run the board and cue records. I spent 20 years at the University of Illinois School of Public Health, and for a lot of that time I was like a laboratory manager. And there again, I bought equipment, I maintained equipment, I taught students how to use equipment. That's been, if there's been a theme through my career, it's been taking care of equipment and teaching people how to use it.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. And then anything else you'd like to say?
Trying to think, maybe if I just, well, I mean, I could talk about the frequency change or, you know, but.
I mean, just from a personal standpoint.
Oh, from a personal standpoint. No, I think that's adequate.